Okay, so last time we left off, at the end of the last lecture, we left off talking about supply and demand, and we introduced where a demand curve comes from, where a supply curve comes from. We derived both of those. We also discussed equilibrium, right? Equilibrium is where quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. And then I mentioned that whatever the price is at equilibrium is known as the market clearing price, and whatever the quantity is at equilibrium, that is, there will be some number where quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. Whatever that quantity is, that is your equilibrium quantity of economic output. Okay? It's also the market clearing quantity. Okay? So we have a market clearing price and a market clearing quantity. Okay? That, as I mentioned before, is what is known as the market clearing. Okay? So now I mentioned that after we did that, we were going to segue to doing some supply and demand problems. Okay? Now that we have the tools necessary to perform supply and demand analysis, we're going to segue to actually performing a supply and demand analysis. Okay? So what we're basically doing here now is if there was some scenario that occurred in the US economy, let's say the stock market crashed, or minimum wage was to rise, or if there was a government stimulus bill, like the Obama stimulus. Okay? What we can do now is analyze what the impact of those policies will be on price and quantity. Okay? That is, we get to determine, using supply and demand, we can determine whether certain policies or scenarios will cause inflation or deflation. Right? If the price goes up, that's inflation. If the price goes down, that's deflation. So we get to determine, using supply and demand analysis, whether there will be inflation or deflation, as well as what happens to the quantity of economic output. Remember, quantity of economic output is how much stuff the economy is making. So we get to see if the economy is going to increase the quantity of economic activity, which is what we call an expansion or a boom, right? That would be if quantity increased, or if quantity decreases, then we know that that particular policy or scenario will cause the economy to go into a recession or a slump. Okay? Now, sometimes some students get confused in reading this diagram, which way is up, which way is down. You can just treat this the same way you treated graphs in pre-algebra. Okay? This is just a simple XY coordinate. This is an increase, right? Along the horizontal axis, to the right means increase. To the left means decrease. Okay? And the same way here on the vertical axis. On the vertical axis, up means something goes up, and down means something goes down. Okay? So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at some policies, okay, and how they will, or scenarios, and how they would impact economic activity and prices. Okay? This analysis forms the core of macroeconomics. Okay? Supply and demand is the core of macroeconomics. You must master this in order to pass the course. Okay? This is something that all three theories that we're going to look at, starting next time, we're going to look at the neoclassical theory, then we're going to look at Keynes, then we're going to look at the textbook Keynesians. Okay? Each one of these schools would all agree on supply and demand analysis. Okay? It's what they do with it that changes, but they all agree on supply and demand analysis. Okay? Now, I also mentioned that I was going to teach you what I call the four-step method. of supply and demand analysis. Okay? I think it's a very easy way for students to grasp how to do this type of analysis. It's very easy to learn how to do supply and demand. Okay? There are other ways of doing supply and demand. I'm sure your book has a different, I know your book has a different way, and some teachers probably ascribe to other theory or other methods of using supply and demand. This is the one that I use. Okay? We're going to get the same results as any other theory. It's just this is the way I prefer to do it. Okay? So to start, what we do is we put a graph on the board. Our quantity and our price. Okay? Then we construct a demand curve at time 0. And then we construct a supply curve at time 0 as well. Okay? Finally, what you do is you would draw out your equilibrium price and quantity. Okay? So we have equilibrium wherever they meet, right, where quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. And then we draw out our equilibrium price and quantity. Actually, instead of using an asterisk, let's just use zeros now. Okay? So this is the price at time 0. And this will be the quantity at time 0. We'll use asterisks when we're done with the analysis. Okay? Right now, I just want to make sure that I have enough board space to the right, so I'm going to go behind the camera very briefly. Okay, so in order to do a 4-step method, what you do is you set up the numbers 1 through 4. And with each one, you're going to put these symbols. D, S, P, Q, Q. Okay? For now, these are the same letter. They're going to change in a second. Okay? We're going to alter the third one in a moment. Okay, so now let's take a scenario. Let's take a simple one. Let's say that President Obama passes a federal stimulus bill. Okay? He increases government spending. Well, I mentioned last time that supply. Right, well, we should backtrack first. So President Obama passes a stimulus bill, okay? The government's going to spend more. They're going to fix a bunch of roads, the Pulaski Skyway, the Newark Airport runways, whichever, okay? The first thing we need to do is figure out whether that's going to impact supply or demand. If the government spends more, will that impact supply or demand? Okay? An easy way to figure out whether a certain scenario or policy is going to impact supply or demand, the easiest way to do that is to think of supply as businesses and demand as the expenditure approach to GDP. Okay? So, what you can think of demand as C plus I plus G plus net exports. Okay? You should remember the expenditure approach to calculating GDP from our first week, from week 1's material, from the first lecture. Second part of the first lecture. Okay? That's how you can think of demand. You can think of demand as total spending. Okay? Whereas for supply, you can think of it as total production. Okay? It's businesses we're talking about with supply. So, if President Obama was to pass a stimulus bill, okay, where the government was to spend more, that would impact demand, right? Demand is spending, supply is producing. If the government spends more, by definition, it is demanding more, which pushes demand up, okay? So, we have our initial demand curve, which is now going to shift, right? Prices haven't changed, so we're not changing quantity demanded, right? It's just the government increased its spending, so therefore prices are the same, and that will shift the demand curve, okay? Well, if the government increases spending, that's going to increase demand. I mentioned at the end of the last lecture, right, part 1, if there's an increase of demand, the demand curve shifts outward or to the northeast. So that will be our new demand curve. Okay? It is shifted that way. Okay? To the right. What we can then do is right here in step 1, you can put an arrow going up next to D because demand has increased. Okay? Now, has anything happened to supply? No, nothing has changed, right? Supply is still right there. The government decided to spend more, but supply hasn't changed. If you remember from the first week's lectures, right? If you want something to stay constant, right, it hasn't changed, it's still constant, you put the little horizontal bar over the variable, okay? So supply is constant, okay? Because nothing has changed. We still have our supply curve right here. That's step 1. Once you're done with step 1, figuring out what changes and what stays constant, then you can draw in new lines into your graph. And I'm giving these asterisks because it's our new equilibrium, right? This is our new equilibrium. So we have a new equilibrium price and quantity. Okay, so in step 2, we have a P here. It stands for price. We need to figure out what happened to prices. Well, prices were here, and now they're here. If this was a 5, this could be a 10. Prices have gone up. Okay? Prices went up. So we can put an arrow next to our P. Okay? Now here's sort of a tricky part. It might be tough to convey this via video. Okay? When you're doing a 4-step method problem, okay, whatever changes in the first step, okay, so in this example, demand changed. Okay? Whatever changes in the first step, you can take the other letter, whatever stays constant, and that constant goes to step 3. Okay? So here, we have demand, and I'm going to clean that up real quickly. Okay? We have demand that increased there. Okay? Supply stayed constant in step 1. Well, since supply stayed constant in step 1, we now add that to step 3. Right here. In step 3, we have a Q. And we're just going to put an S there. What step 3 has become now is quantity supplied. Okay? Step 3 initially was just a Q that stood for quantity. Now, step 3 stands for quantity supplied. Okay? to go from step 2 to step 3, you need to have the law of supply or the law of demand memorized. Okay? Both of them you need to have memorized. In step 2, we saw that prices went up. Okay? The law of supply tells us that when prices go up, quantity supplied goes up. And that is the law of supply. So from here, step 2 and step 3, well, in step 3, we want to know about quantity supplied. Well, we know what's going to happen to quantity supplied because in step 2, we know that prices go up. Okay? So if prices go up, quantity supplied goes up. Okay? And finally, in step 4, we were here at Q0. Our level of economic output was at Q0. Now it's at Q star. So it went this way. If you're looking at a horizontal axis, this could be a 5, this is a 10, then that means that the overall quantity of economic activity increased. So to summarize, the initial policy I discussed was, let's suppose President Obama has another Obama stimulus, right? There's another federal government stimulus package. Well, if that was to happen, what supply and demand analysis tells us is that if Obama was to pass another government stimulus bill, demand would go up, but supply would stay constant initially. When demand went up, that would increase prices. As prices go up, that will increase the quantity supplied, right? The law of supply. As prices go up, quantity supplied goes up. Finally, step 4 tells us that there will be an increase in the overall level of economic output. Okay? So in other words, in Obama's stimulus, and this is actually what they were trying to do. What Obama's stimulus was trying to do was it wanted to increase demand, which would push up prices a little bit, and that increase in prices would cause businesses to increase their quantity supplied, which would then cause the overall level of economic output to increase, which is step 4. Okay? So, did it work? I would argue, yes, of course it worked. Anytime you're losing 800,000 jobs a month, and then you're only losing 250,000 jobs a month, that was a major success. So you might then say, Devin, why are we still in a recession or a depression? Maybe it wasn't big enough. And there's a lot of research that's been done as to why the number was $787 billion. Okay? The answer as to how they decided on a number for the Obama stimulus was Henry Paulson thought 787 was simply a nice number that he could probably get through Congress, even though most of them thought it needed to be a bigger stimulus. Okay? That's why you haven't seen as large of an increase in economic output as we would like to. Okay? Demand increased, but not by as much as we wanted it to. Right? Spending didn't increase as much as it was needed to be increased. So therefore, you didn't get as large of a jump in the quantity of economic output. Okay? This is the 4-step method. Okay? It's a pretty easy thing to master, I believe at least. Enough students have done it. To set up, again, you do DSPQQ. And then if you set up DSPQQ, there's only a few things you need to do correctly. In the first step, you need to figure out whether supply or demand is going to change. And you do that by recognizing that supply is businesses, and you're talking about producing things. It's businesses producing things, whereas demand is talking about spending. Okay? Then, in step 2, with prices, you simply look at whether prices went up or down. In step 3, I mentioned that whatever stays constant in the first step then goes down to step 3. So in this example, supply stayed constant, which we then added an S down in step 3, where it became quantity supplied, right? Quantity supplied. So that's what that's step 3. Then to figure out which way the arrow goes in step 3, you simply look at the second step and see if prices went up or down. In this instance, we saw that prices went up, and we know from the law of supply that when prices go up, quantity supplied goes up. Okay? So we put an arrow here for quantity supplied going up. Finally, step 4, you just look at the horizontal axis. Did your overall quantity of economic output go up or down? Okay? Let's do a couple more examples of this. That's probably too high. Okay, let's do another example. Let's say what's the impact of a stock market crash? Okay, a stock market crash. Well, does that impact businesses or spending? Well, the stock market is where people make investments. Okay, that's what the stock market is. People invest in the stock market. So if the stock market crashes, that means there is less investment. If there's less investment, that means demand has gone down. Okay? So if the stock market crashes, demand goes down because if the stock market crashes, there's less people investing. Okay? So this was our original demand curve. That's our original demand curve. Now, we're going to have to shift it to the left because demand has gone down. Okay? We have a new demand curve right here, and it intersects the supply curve at this equilibrium. Okay? So demand has gone down, so we can draw that in here. And supply has stayed constant. It hasn't changed yet. Since supply has stayed constant in the first step, we can put an S down in the third step once again. Okay? Now we have our new equilibrium. That I'm going to put some asterisks with. Okay? So, this was our original equilibrium. This is our new one. Okay? And we need to figure out what has happened since the stock market crashed and people invested less. Well, prices went down. Right? Prices were here, now they're here. Prices decreased. We know from the law of supply that when prices decrease, quantity supplied decreases. And we can actually show that on our graph right here. This was our equilibrium. This is our new equilibrium. And when prices change, that means quantity supplied changes, right? Whenever there's a change in price, there's a change in quantity. So if prices go down, then there's a decrease in quantity supplied. Which means, since the price changed, since the price decreased, quantity supplied goes down. That means we are going to slide down our supply curve. We're going to slide down the supply curve. Okay? So, quantity supplied decreased. Finally, we had this quantity originally. Now we have this quantity. So, overall that has decreased as well. So if the stock market crashes, what's going to happen to it? Well, this analysis says, what's going to happen to the economy? This analysis says that if the stock market crashes, demand will decrease, nothing's going to happen to supply initially. And so once demand decreases, that's going to push prices down. Once prices decrease, then that's going to cause the quantity supplied to decrease. Okay, that's just simple, it's the law of supply. Prices go down, quantity supplied goes down. Finally, the overall quantity of economic activity has decreased. How well does that reconcile with our experience in 2008, right? In 2008, the stock market crashed. Well, what happened? When the stock market crashed, a lot of people stopped spending money, so demand went down. When demand went down, prices went down as well. When those prices went down, businesses said, hey, I'm not going to produce things anymore. There's no incentive for me to, because prices have gone down. So they reduced their quantity supplied. When they reduced their quantity supplied, they didn't need as many workers to produce the stuff they were producing, right? Because the amount of stuff that business was going to make had dropped. So if you don't need as many workers to produce less stuff, you fire them, which means unemployment goes up. And finally, what ended up happening is the overall quantity of economic output also decreased. Okay? So a stock market crash, as we have just seen in 2008, causes demand to go down, prices to go down, the quantity supplied to go down, unemployment to go up. That's not in the four-step method, but it's a corollary. And then the fourth step tells us the overall quantity of economic output has decreased. Okay? So far we've covered two examples. We covered an example when the demand goes up. We covered an example when demand goes down. Okay? Now we're going to do two examples with supply. That is, we're going to do two examples when supply changes first in the first step. So what could possibly cause supply to change? Well, remember I said yesterday and today that supply can be thought of as businesses. Okay? Supply is businesses and what businesses are producing. Well, if supply happens to, what would cause supply to change? Well, businesses are interested in making profit. So what would cause profit to change? I mentioned that it's revenues and the cost of production. So let's start looking at different costs businesses incur. Okay? For the first example, let's say that the minimum wage is abolished. Okay? There's no such thing as the minimum wage anymore. Okay? The federal government said, I don't know why we ever had this minimum wage. We should not have it. Okay? So there's no minimum wage anymore. If that was to occur, then businesses could pay their workers 5, 6 cents an hour, right? Even 2 cents an hour. Okay? So if businesses had to pay workers less, what are they going to get more of? They're going to get more profit, right? If you were running a business, right now you have to pay your workers at least $7.85 an hour, I believe. I think it's $7.85 an hour, okay? If you didn't have to pay your workers $7.85 an hour, if you had to pay them 2 cents an hour, that means your costs have gone down. If your costs go down, there's more money left over for you. That money is what economists call profit. Okay? Whatever is left over after a business pays its costs is profit. If there was more profit, then businesses are going to supply more, right? I'm making more money. My profits have gone through the roof. I don't have to pay my workers as much as I did in the past. Well, if that's the case, then you're going to increase your supply, right? It makes sense. I'm making all this money. I'm going to produce more stuff, no matter what the price is. Okay? So, supply will increase. If the minimum wage is abolished, then aggregate supply goes up. An increase of supply, we saw yesterday. Increased supply means that the supply curve shifts to the right and down. Okay, to the right and down. That is, it goes to the southeast. Okay? Well, we could already start our 4-step method. Has demand changed? No, demand hasn't changed. It's just right here. It's the same line we drew initially 5 minutes ago. So demand is constant, but supply has gone up. Okay? And just FYI, as an aside, I haven't mentioned this yet, it doesn't matter which side you put the arrows on, okay, in the 4-step method. It doesn't matter if you put the arrow over here or over here. It doesn't matter. It's still that variable that's going up. I understand what you're doing. Okay? So, since demand stayed constant in the first step, then in the third step we already know we can put a D. Okay? So the third step becomes quantity demanded. Okay? Now, we had our initial equilibrium right there. Let's see what our new equilibrium is going to be. Our new equilibrium is right here. At this quantity and this price. Okay. Well, what happened to prices? They went down. Okay? So prices went down. Well, now we have to figure out quantity demanded. We know that if prices go down, quantity demand goes up. That's the law of demand. If prices go down, quantity demanded goes up. Okay? So, we can write an arrow right there for quantity demanded. Okay? We can make an arrow going up for quantity demand. Because when prices dropped, we slid down our demand curve. Slid down the demand curve. Okay. Finally, what's happened to the overall quantity of economic output? Well, we were here, now we're here, so it's increased. The overall quantity of economic output has gone up. Okay. So, what would be the impact of abolishing the minimum wage? the impact of abolishing the minimum wage would be supply goes up, demand stays constant. That would cause prices to go down. When you produce more stuff, it's more abundant. If it's more abundant, then it's relatively less valuable. If something is relatively less valuable, that means its price goes down. So prices go down, which increases the quantity demand. When prices go down, the law of demand says that if the price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. Okay? Finally, that leads to an overall increase in the level of economic output. Okay? So this is what the impact would be of the if we abolish the minimum wage. Okay. Finally, we need to look at a decrease of supply, right? We've done an example where demand went up. We've done an example where demand goes down. We did an example where supply went up. Now we need to do an example where supply goes down. What would cause a business to want to decrease their supply of things? Okay, why would they no longer want to produce as much as they were producing? Well, there's one thing the federal government does, one policy, that I feel is a very bad policy. It's called the payroll tax. Currently, we tax employers, we tax businesses for having employees. For every worker you have, you are taxed. That's the payroll tax. If we eliminated it, then businesses would probably hire more people because they would have to pay less tax. But let's say in this example that the US government decides to increase the payroll tax. Let's say it takes the rate of the payroll tax from 25% to 70%. That is, for every worker they have to pay 70% of his salary or her salary to the government. Okay? Well, if you were suddenly taxed more for hiring people, right, it becomes more expensive to have the same number of employees. So what you're going to do is you're probably going to not produce as much, right? If you had to pay more to the government in taxes and you're a business, you're probably going to end up producing less. So what that would do, when a business produces less, that decreases supply. Okay, so if there's a decrease of supply because the US government raises the payroll tax, supply will go down and demand stays constant. If demand stays constant in step 1, then in step 3 we can put a D. Turn this into quantity demanded. Okay? Now, supply has gone down, demand has stayed constant. Let's look at what happened to prices. Prices were here, now they're here. They've gone up. Why did they go up? Well, we were producing 10 bottles of water. Now we're producing only 5, right? Because we're taxed, my company is being taxed more. So I'm not going to produce the same amount of water bottles that I was in the past, right? Now, what would end up happening there is, if the supply goes down, then those water bottles, there's less of them. If there's less water bottles, then they become more valuable. Because they are relatively scarce. If they're relatively scarce, they become more valuable. If something's more valuable, its price goes up. So prices have gone up. Okay? Prices went up. We know from the law of demand that if prices go up, quantity demanded goes down. Okay? So here, prices went up. We're going to slide up the demand curve, right? Change in price, change in quantity demand. Price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. So we're going to slide along the curve. Okay? Quantity demanded has gone down. Finally, we can look at our overall quantity of economic output. We were here, now we're here. So our quantity has gone down. The overall level of economic output has gone down. So, in the fourth step, we can put an arrow with our Q going down. Okay? So, if the US government was to increase the payroll tax, what that would do is it would keep demand constant, but businesses would supply less. If businesses supply less, that's going to push up prices. When those prices go up, quantity demanded will go down, which will result in the overall level of economic output going down as well. Okay? This is actually what happened in 2011, 2012, when President Obama and John Boehner, the leader of the Speaker of the House, were trying to work out what was called the Grand Bargain. And during the Grand Bargain, the Republicans demanded that the payroll tax be increased. Okay? When the payroll tax was increased, what we ended up seeing in economics was that prices went up slightly and the quantity demanded of economic output went down and the overall level of economic output went down, right? Businesses were taxed more, right? When the GOP, excuse me, when the GOP raised the payroll tax, what ended up happening is businesses supplied less, which made things relatively scarce, made them more valuable, pushed up the price. When the prices went up, the quantity demanded went down, and the level of overall economic output went down as well. Okay? At which point we decided then, Obama and Boehner went back to the table and decided they needed to work out the payroll tax another way. They needed to create another deal on it. Okay? But that's just contemporary economic history for now. The important point to get out of these lectures is the 4 examples we did. Okay? When President Obama passed the stimulus bill, right, the first example we did, there was increased government spending, and that increased economic output and also prices. Okay? Then we talked about a stock market crashing, which we saw will decrease demand. Okay? In the third example, we saw what would happen if the minimum wage was abolished. If the minimum wage was abolished, then supply would increase. And in the fourth example, we saw that the payroll tax was increased from 20% to 75%, or whatever I said. And in that example, when the payroll tax was increased, what ended up happening was supply went down. Okay? Those are the 4 examples of supply and demand analysis. Okay? You start off every single 4-step method the same way. You always set it up DSPQQ. Okay? We'll do another one too. We'll just do one more extra practice problem. But you always set it up DSPQQ. Okay? And then as long as you get the first step right, you'll get the rest of the problem right. Okay? Now on exams, if you don't get the first step right, I'm not going to grade the entire problem as if it were wrong. Okay? If you get the first step right, I'm going to take off, or the first step wrong, I'll take off for the first step. But after that, I'll act as if you did get it correct and see if you could follow the rest of the problem. Okay? Also, if you want to practice this more, there are practice problems on Blackboard labeled as supply and demand practice questions along with an answer key. Okay? I would recommend you look at that. Okay? Especially if you want more help at this, if you don't think you're comfortable at it. But let's do one more very quickly. I'm going to set up the 4 steps first. So you set up every problem DSPQQ. Okay? And this is how you would set up the graph. Now, on your exams, since this is an online course that's done electronically, and you're emailing your exams to me, you're not going to be able to do a graph. That's okay. On your exams, all you need to include for me is the 4 steps. Okay? Just tell me what happens to demand, and you don't even have to draw it with arrows and 4 steps. In fact, I'm going to want you to put it in a paragraph form where you say, okay, let's take the example from before. Abolishing the minimum wage will increase supply and leave demand constant. When that happens, increased supply and demand will stay constant. When that happens, prices will go down, which will cause the quantity demanded to go up and will result in the overall level of economic output going up. Okay? It's an easy way to do it. I'll go over another example when we're done with this one, right? I'll say how to put this into a paragraph form. Let's say that suddenly there's an increase of consumer spending, right? Consumers go out and they just start spending like crazy. We can't get to Walmart, Best Buy, and Macy's enough. It's the holiday season, right? It's Christmas time, okay? So, if that was to happen, if people were to go out and spend more, what would change, supply or demand? Well, demand would change, right? Because demand is total spending. If people increase their consumption, then total spending would go up. So this is our original demand curve. And that will be our new one. So demand has gone up, and supply has stayed constant. Since supply stayed constant in step 1, we now put it down in step 3. Okay? Now, if you're doing this along with me at home, what you do is you have your initial equilibrium, you have your new equilibrium. When you have your new equilibrium, what you do is, let's look at price, right? Price. What happened there? Well, they went up. Okay? Prices went up. What happens to the quantity supplied when prices go up? Well, when prices go up, the law of supply tells us when prices go up, the quantity supplied goes up. Finally, what happened to the overall quantity of economic output? We were here, now we're here. So the overall quantity of economic output went up as well. This is, in fact, what we typically see at Christmas time, right? At Christmas, everyone has to go to Walmart and Best Buy and Macy's and what have you, okay? When that happens, when we go out and we buy gifts for each other, or if it's Hanukkah, or whatever's the holiday we're celebrating, okay? When that happens, the increase of consumer spending pushes up demand. When demand goes up, and supply stays constant at that point, right? The store only has so much it can sell. There's only so many TVs in Best Buy. But now everyone's rushing in to Best Buy to get TVs and tablets and things like that. Well, when that happens, everything in Best Buy becomes relatively more scarce, right? People all want the same TV, so it's sort of a competition to see who can get the best TV immediately, right? What that does is it pushes up prices, okay? So demand increases, supply stays constant. That pushes up prices, and then when businesses like Best Buy see that prices are going up, they say, okay, we need to increase our quantity supplied. So prices go up, quantity supplied goes up. And finally what happens is the overall quantity of economic output goes up, which you always see around December, right? You see around Christmas time, and even November now, that the economy always picks up steam. The economy picks up steam because of, and sort of when I say steam, I mean that it enters into a boom period of sorts. Why is that? Because consumer spending has gone up, right? People are going out and buying televisions, buying DVD players, buying Blu-ray players, what have you, okay? So, how would you write this on an exam? How would you express this formally? All you need to say, right, you would do this on your scratch paper for an exam, and then what you do is you would say, okay, when there's an increase of consumer spending, what's going to happen is demand will go up, supply will stay constant. Once that happens, that's going to push up prices. That will increase prices. When prices increase, the law of supply tells us that if the price goes up, the quantity supplied will go up. And finally, the overall quantity of economic output will increase as well. Okay? That's how you could write it in a paragraph. If you wanted to give me the arrows on an exam, that's fine too. Okay? But if you wanted to, if you want to put it into a paragraph form, or if I tell you you have to put it into a paragraph form, that is how you would do it. Okay? So that's supply and demand. Okay? That's supply so far in this chapter, chapter 3, which is week 2, okay? Week 2's material, which we're now done with. So far what we looked at is supply and demand, equilibrium, right? What equilibrium is. Equilibrium is when quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. We looked at what a shortage is. We looked at what a surplus is, and how both of those will ultimately get back to equilibrium. And we've looked at the 4-step method and supply and demand analysis, right? We started using supply and demand, we started using it to analyze what would happen to an economy if a policy or a scenario transpired, okay? So now what we're going to do, we're going to start shifting gears a little. And the next sections are going to be a little tougher. Now that we have supply and demand under our belt, okay, and if you don't have it under your belt yet, that's fine. Do the practice problems. Okay? If you still need help after the practice problems, shoot me an email or come to my office. Okay? Set up an appointment or just drop in. But now that we have supply and demand under our belt, what we can end up doing is now we're going to segue and we're going to look at the neoclassical model. Then we're going to look at Keynes and the post-Keynesians. And then we're going to look at the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis, aka the textbook Keynesians. Okay? So that's going to be the topic of our next 3 lectures. Okay? As I've mentioned, all 3 of those agree with supply and demand analysis. Okay? They all agree on supply and demand. But ultimately, they all think the economy works in different ways, even though they all agree on supply and demand. They apply it in different ways. How they apply it is what we're going to look at for the rest of the semester. Okay? We're going to look at 3 different theories, and we're going to look at the policies that each one of them recommend. Okay? So now I'm going to go and turn the camera off, and you can take a break, and if you want, keep on going, and let's look at the neoclassical model.